The sun in the Arizona territory doesn't just shine on you, it tries to kill you. It hammers the land into a red-dusted anvil, and on this day, Abigail Hayes felt like she was the one being forged, or maybe broken. Dust was a second skin on her face, caked with sweat. Her knuckles were split open and raw, stinging with every clenched fist. Below her, the bodies of 4 coyotes lay sprawled in the dirt. Their whimpers had finally faded, leaving only the vast, humming silence of the desert. She had won, but out here winning just meant you gotta survive until the next thing tried to kill you. And that's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was a groan, a sound scraped from the depths of a man's soul. Her head snapped toward a jumble of red rocks at the edge of her property. Her heart, which had been hammering a victory beat against her ribs, suddenly went cold and still. She grabbed the gnarled mesquite club she'd used to defend her calf, its wood now dark and slick with blood, and moved toward the sound. He was tucked into a sliver of shade, almost invisible, an Apache warrior. His long black hair was matted with dirt, a single eagle feather clinging to a desperate strand. A deep, angry gash ran down his cheek, but that wasn't the worst of it. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his side. A bullet wound. He was dying. Every instinct, every whispered story she'd ever heard about the bloody clashes between settlers and the Apache screamed at her to turn around, to walk away, to let the desert claim him. Helping him wasn't just a risk, it was a death sentence. To be found with him by the cavalry, or worse, by local ranchers, would be the end of her. She took a step back, her knuckles white on the club. He was nothing to her, a ghost, a problem she didn't need. But then, his eyelids fluttered. They opened just a crack, his eyes as dark as obsidian, clouded with pain. For one impossible second, they focused on her. His lips, cracked and bleeding, parted. In a single word, a whisper that should have been carried away by the wind, shot through the air and struck her like a physical blow. Abigail. The world stopped. The sun, the heat, the buzzing flies, all of it vanished. It was her name. Not a plea, not a curse. Her given name. The name she had buried 5 years ago, 1,000 miles away, in a shallow grave alongside the woman she used to be. No one here knew her as Abigail. In the dusty town of Redemption, she was just Miss Hayes, the quiet woman who kept to herself. How? How could this dying stranger, this Apache warrior from the deep wilderness, know the one secret she had protected with her life? It was a trick. It had to be a fever dream, brought on by the sun and the fight. But the shock was real, more stunning than the attack from the coyotes. It rooted her to the spot, her mind a screaming whirlwind of impossible questions. His eyes slid closed again, and his breathing turned into a shallow rattling sound, the sound of a man on his last breath. The desert gave you 2 choices, tempered or broken, and now it was giving her another one. Leave him to die and let his secret die with him, or risk absolutely everything, her home, her freedom, her life, to find out how he knew her name. To let him die now meant living with the ghost of that whisper for the rest of her days. She let out a curse that was half a prayer and made her choice. She dropped the bloodied club. Gritting her teeth against the pain in her own battered body, she hooked her arms under his and began to drag him. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone, and a terrifying, world-shattering secret. She dragged him away from the rocks, across the sun-scorched earth, and toward the dubious safety of her small cabin. She was dragging the past, the present, and a future so uncertain it felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. The real fight, she realized, had only just begun. The floorboards of her one-room cabin groaned as she hauled him inside. The place was her entire world. A cot, a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table. It was sparse, but it was hers. A bastion of order against the chaos outside. Now that chaos was bleeding on her floor. For a moment she just stood there, panting, the sheer insanity of the situation hitting her like a wave. Here she was, Abigail Hayes, formerly Abigail Sterling of the Philadelphia Sterlings, a family whose name was spoken with the same hushed reverence as Vanderbilt, hiding a wounded Apache warrior who had somehow pulled her name out of the empty desert air. His unconsciousness was a mercy. It let her work without his eyes on her, without the questions that hung between them like a razor wire. She tore strips from one of her few clean linen sheets, the fine fabric, a ghostly reminder of a life she'd fled. She boiled water, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a survivor. This was her new reality. The bullet was still inside him, lodged deep. The flesh around the wound was hot and angry, a violent red against his sun-darkened skin. She knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that if she didn't get that bullet out, he would die, and his secret would die with him. She gently cleaned the gash on his face, washing away the blood and grime. Beneath it, she saw a strong face, with high cheekbones and a proud aquiline nose. Even slack with pain, it was a face carved with dignity. Fine black tattoos, geometric patterns, marked his jaw and the backs of his hands. Stories she couldn't read. Then he started to shiver. Not a small tremor, but a violent, bone-rattling quake that had nothing to do with the suffocating heat of the cabin. The fever was taking hold. He began to mutter in his own language, the words guttural and strange. But then, a single clear word cut through the foreign tongue, a word that sounded both alien and terrifyingly familiar coming from his lips. Abigail. He groaned it, followed by a stream of Apache. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. She was in over her head. She needed help. But the only help was 10 miles away in Redemption, a town simmering with tension between prospectors, ranchers, and the ever-present threat of the U.S. cavalry. Bringing a doctor here would be signing this man's death warrant, and maybe her own. Her mind latched onto one name, Maria Garcia. Maria ran the mercantile in town. She was a woman who seemed older than the territory itself, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding the wisdom of generations who understood this land. Maria traded with everyone, miners, settlers, and, it was whispered, even the Apache. She knew herbs, remedies, and most importantly, she knew how to keep her mouth shut. Leaving the warrior was a risk, but letting him die wasn't an option, not until she had her answer. She placed a wet cloth on his forehead, secured the door, and pushed her horse harder than she ever had before. The ride was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Redemption was a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the air thick with the smell of manure, cheap whiskey, and simmering violence. Men watched her pass, their gazes lingering. A lone woman was always a curiosity, or a target. She found Maria behind the counter of her cluttered store, a place that smelled of cinnamon, coffee beans, and tanned leather. "Miss Hayes," Maria said, her voice calm. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Abigail leaned on the counter, catching her breath. "I need your help, Maria. I found a man, hurt badly, a bullet." Maria's dark eyes sharpened. She didn't ask who or where. She only asked the important question. "White man?" Abigail hesitated for a split second, a second that seemed to stretch for an eternity. "No." The old woman's expression didn't change, but a deep understanding passed between them. Maria reached under the counter and began gathering items. A pouch of willow bark for the fever, dried yarrow to pack the wound, and a small, sharp-looking knife wrapped in oilcloth. As she worked, she slid something else across the counter. A small, round piece of lead, a flattened bullet she must have dug out of someone else. "I found one of these in a prospector a month ago," she said quietly, "near your claim. It is custom-made, heavy caliber, not cavalry issue, the work of a rich man who likes to hunt." A rich man, hunting, near her land. A new layer of fear, cold and specific, settled over Abigail. This wasn't a random skirmish. The warrior on her floor had been hunted. "There is a new man in the valley," Maria continued, her voice low. "A rancher, Blackwood his name is. He has bought up the old Miller Ranch and a dozen other claims. He is a man with a long shadow and a short temper, especially when it comes to the Indi, the people." The name Blackwood meant nothing to Abigail, just another faceless threat. "I don't have a choice," she said. "We always have a choice, Mija," Maria corrected gently. "You have chosen this one." She pushed a heavy bottle across the counter. "Whiskey, for him before you cut, and for you after." Abigail paid with the last of her coins. As she turned to leave, Maria's voice stopped her. "The man you found," she said, her tone serious. "Does he have a name?" Abigail thought of the impossible whisper that had started it all. "I don't know," she lied. Back at the cabin, the fever had taken full hold. The warrior, her patient, her prisoner, her mystery, was delirious. He thrashed on the cot, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring into a world she couldn't fathom. And in that delirium, fragments of his story, and horrifyingly hers, began to surface. He spoke in a torrent of Apache, but his visions, it seemed, were in English. "Sergeant Miller!" he yelled once, his voice full of venom. Then softer, a name spoken with such tenderness it made Abigail's heart ache. "Nalin!" But it was the other words, the other images that swam up from the depths of his fevered mind that turned her blood to ice. "Carriages. So much noise," he muttered, his brow furrowed. "Green grass. Not like here. Water everywhere. Locked gates." Abigail froze, the whiskey bottle halfway to her lips. Green grass. Locked gates. It was a perfect, fever dream description of an eastern estate, of her eastern estate. "Sterling?" he gasped, his body arching in pain. The Sterling house, big, cold. They watched from the windows. The broken songbird. In the silver cage. The whiskey bottle slipped from her numb fingers and crashed to the floor. Sterling. He had said her family name. But that wasn't the worst part. The broken songbird in the silver cage. It was a secret nickname. A tender, sad name her mother used to call her when her father's expectations became too much. A name no one else on earth could possibly know. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a random guess. This man, this Apache warrior from the other side of the world, somehow knew the most intimate secrets of the gilded cage she had nearly died to escape. Her own past came rushing back, a suffocating presence in the tiny cabin. She remembered her father, a man who measured his daughter's worth by the advantageousness of her marriage. And she remembered Silas, Silas Blackwood. Maria's words hit her again. Blackwood. A new man in the valley. It couldn't be. Her fiancé. The man chosen by her father. The man with the cold eyes and the possessive grip. The man she had fled. She had staged a riding accident, let the world believe she was dead, and disappeared into the vast anonymity of the West. Now, staring at the delirious man on her cot, a horrifying possibility began to form, a puzzle piece so monstrous she could barely look at it. How could this warrior's path and hers have ever crossed? Had he been a prisoner? A servant? She pushed the questions down. The bullet had to come out. Now. Following Maria's instructions, she poured whiskey between his lips. She took the small, sharp knife, sterilized it in the flame of a candle, and began to cut. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. He screamed, a raw animal sound of pure agony that threatened to break her. He fought her with delirious strength, and she had to throw her entire body over him to hold him down, her tears mingling with the sweat on her face. But she didn't stop. Guided by sheer desperation, she probed the wound. Finally, her fingers brushed against it. A small, hard lump of lead lodged against a rib. With a final, desperate effort, she worked it loose. The bullet, slick with blood, dropped into a tin bowl with a clatter. It was heavy, misshapen. A rich man's bullet. He went limp, his breathing shallow but steady. She packed the wound with yarrow and bandaged it tightly. Exhausted, covered in his blood, she slumped into the chair. The storm had passed, leaving a fragile, terrifying calm. She had saved him. For now. But in doing so, she had unearthed a ghost. The man on her cot was a living, breathing link to a past she had fled. The mystery of how he knew her name was no longer a curiosity. It was a direct and mortal threat. His presence here had just turned the key in a lock she thought was buried forever. And outside, under the vast desert sky, a man named Blackwood, the man with the cold eyes, the man she thought she'd escaped, was building an empire, and he was hunting. Days bled into one another, measured only by the rising and setting of that relentless sun. The warrior whose name she still didn't know clung to life by a thread. The fever lingered, but the violent delirium subsided, replaced by a deep, healing sleep. Abigail fell into a routine, boiling water, changing dressings, forcing sips of broth between his lips, and watching, always watching. She slept in the chair, her Winchester rifle leaning against its legs. Trust was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. Every time he stirred, she was awake instantly, her hand on the cold steel of the rifle. Who was he? Was his knowledge of her a weapon he was just waiting to use? During the long, quiet hours, the name Silas Blackwood echoed in her mind. Now that Maria had spoken it, and the warrior had connected it to her past, the fire of her fear was raging. She saw Silas's face in the flickering firelight, the handsome features, the thin, unsmiling lips, the possessive gleam in his pale blue eyes. She remembered the night she decided to flee. He'd given her a wedding gift, a diamond necklace. As he fastened it, his fingers cold against her skin, he'd whispered, "It is a collar, my dear, a beautiful collar for a beautiful prize." That night, she had pried the jewels from their settings and sewn them into the hem of her plainest dress. They were the seeds of her new life, a life that was now threatening to burn to the ground. On the fifth day, she was scrubbing the bloodstains from the floorboards when she felt his eyes on her. She looked up slowly. He was awake. The fever had broken. The obsidian eyes that watched her were clear, lucid, and filled with an unnerving intelligence. The silence stretched, thick with 1,000 unspoken questions. "Water," he rasped, his voice raw. She brought it to him, holding his head up so he could drink. He drank deeply, his gaze never leaving her face. He sank back onto the cot, his breath still shallow. "You are Abigail," he stated. It wasn't a question. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "How do you know that name?" she demanded, her voice tighter than she intended. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing it. "I saw you," he said finally, his English slow and deliberate, but clear. "A long time ago. A world away from this one?" He began to speak, and the story he told was more fantastic and horrifying than anything she could have imagined. His name was Cale. He and his younger sister Nalin had been captured years before. Not by the army, but by slavers who sold them to a wealthy landowner in the East. They were called indentured servants, but it was slavery by another name. And the landowner's estate was right next to the Sterlings. "I worked in the stables," Kyle said, his eyes fixed on a distant, painful memory. "I was a boy. I saw you riding. You wore a green dress. You rode like the wind, your hair flying behind you. You were the only thing in that place that looked free." Abigail stared at him, speechless. She remembered the green dress. She remembered the brief period where her only solace was riding, pushing her horse to its limits as if she could outrun her own fate. "The servants, they spoke of you," Cale continued. "The daughter of the big house, Abigail. They said you were to be married to a man with cold eyes." Silas. "My sister, Nalin, she did not work in the stables. She worked in your house." The cabin seemed to shrink, the air growing thin. His sister worked in her house. "She got sick," Cal said, a muscle tightening in his jaw, a flash of the warrior beneath the wounded man. "The coughing sickness. Your father's man, the one with the cold eyes. He was there often. He said she was damaged goods. He would not allow a doctor. He said it was a waste of money." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words 1,000 times more terrible. "She told me about you. She said you were kind to her when no one was looking. She said you were like a bird trapped in a cage, a broken songbird." The room tilted. It was his sister. His sister who had heard the secret nickname and passed it to him. His sister whose death was hastened by the casual cruelty of the man Abigail was supposed to marry. A man who was now, impossibly, here. "Nalin died in my arms," Cale said softly. "After that, there was nothing left for me there but hate. I took a horse. I rode west. I rode until I found my people again. I was tracking the man who hunted us, Sergeant Miller, when I was shot by a rich man's bullet." The story settled around them, a truth so strange and powerful it altered the very air she breathed. He wasn't a threat. He was a survivor, just like her. They were two people from opposite ends of the universe, both scarred by the same gilded world, both fleeing to the desert to escape their own form of bondage. The wall of suspicion in Abigail's heart didn't just crack, it crumbled. She saw not an Apache warrior, but a man named Cale, who had lost everything and still found his way home. A man whose sister's ghost now stood between them. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words hopelessly inadequate. "About your sister." He simply nodded, a deep, profound grief in his eyes. "You fought the Coyotes," he said, changing the subject. "I saw before the darkness took me." He looked at her split knuckles, the fading bruises on her arms. "You fight like a warrior." A fragile truce bloomed in the small cabin, nurtured by shared stories and a growing unspoken respect. He began to heal, his strength returning with surprising speed. He taught her a few words in his language. She read to him from one of her books. The space between the cot and the chair shrank until she was sitting on the edge of his bed, changing his dressing without the Winchester by her side. But the world outside their small sanctuary was not idle. One afternoon, a rider approached. Not the shambling gait of a prospector, but the confident, straight-back posture of a man who owned the very ground he rode over. Abigail's blood ran cold. She knew even before he was close enough to see clearly who it was. The expensive cut of his coat, the powerful bay horse, they were echoes of a life she had buried. Kyle, sitting up for the first time, saw the look on her face. "Who is it?" "A ghost," she whispered. "The man with the cold eyes." The rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He was older, his face weathered by the western sun, but it was unmistakably him, Silas Blackwood. He walked to her door, his pale eyes sweeping over her homestead with a look of disdainful appraisal. He hadn't recognized her. To him, she was just another squatter on a piece of land he wanted. "Quite the hovel you've got here," he said, his voice the same smooth, condescending baritone she remembered with a shudder. "I am Silas Blackwood. I own this valley, and you, madam, are on my land." "This is my claim," Abigail said, her voice impossibly steady despite the hurricane in her chest. "Filed and legal." He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Pieces of paper are for back east. Out here, ownership is simpler. I want this plot. There's a spring nearby. Water's power here. I'll give you $200 for your trouble." It was a pittance, but it was the way he said it, the absolute assumption of her immediate compliance, that stoked the embers of her anger into a flame. "It's not for sale," she said. His eyes narrowed. For the first time, he was truly looking at her, past the worn clothes and the sun-browned skin. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, then dawning, incredulous recognition. The world seemed to stop spinning. "Abigail?" He breathed the name, a curse on his lips. "It can't be. You're dead." "Reports were exaggerated," she said, her voice dripping with ice. His shock curdled into a dark, possessive fury. "You!" he snarled, taking a step forward. "You ran from me. You embarrassed my family. You belong to me." "I belong to no one," she shot back, standing her ground. It was then that Cale appeared in the doorway behind her. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, still weak, but he was standing. He wore a pair of her deceased father's old trousers, and his bare chest was tightly bandaged, but his presence was a potent declaration. Silas's gaze flickered to Cale, and his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly bigotry. "What is this?" he spat. "You trade a Blackwood for this? A red-skinned savage?" The venom in his voice seemed to poison the air. He looked from Cale's proud, defiant face to Abigail's, and the pieces clicked into place in his loathsome mind. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "This is what you've become." He backed away toward his horse, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The offer is withdrawn. This is my valley. You have 1 week to be off this land. If you're still here when I return, I'll burn this cabin to the ground, with both of you inside." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Abigail stood trembling, not with fear, but with a white-hot rage. The past hadn't just found her. It had come to claim her, more monstrous and real than ever before. She looked back at Cale, who was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a grim, knowing sorrow. "The man with the cold eyes," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The fragile peace was gone, shattered by the ghost from her past. The fight for her homestead was no longer about a piece of land or a hidden spring. It was a fight for her very soul, for the freedom she had sacrificed everything to find. And now she would not be fighting it alone. The week that followed was not one of fear, but of furious preparation. Silas Blackwood's ultimatum hadn't broken them. It had forged them into a weapon. The small cabin became a war room. They were no longer patient and protector. They were partners, soldiers in a war with an army of two. Abigail's terror had crystallized into a hard, defiant resolve. Silas had made a fatal error. He had cornered an animal who had already learned to fight for her life, and like the coyotes, he would find she had teeth. "He will not come himself, not at first," Cale said, his voice gaining strength each day. He was now able to walk, albeit slowly, his body healing with a speed that amazed her. "Men like him think their money makes them kings. They do not like to get their own hands dirty." Kyle, despite his lingering weakness, began to teach her. He showed her how to read the land, not as a landscape, but as a map of advantages and disadvantages. He pointed out the natural choke points in the rocky terrain, the blind spots, the places an ambush could be set. He taught her how to muffle the sound of her footsteps, how to use the rising and setting sun as a blinding weapon against an enemy. In turn, Abigail taught him about her rifle. The Winchester was an extension of her own arm, but Cale held it with a reverent curiosity. His weapon had been the bow, an instrument of silence and skill. The rifle was a tool of thunder and finality. He learned quickly, his keen eyes making him a natural marksman. They practiced in a small, hidden arroyo, the shots echoing through the canyons, a declaration of their defiance. In these moments of shared purpose, something deeper grew between them. It was in the way he would watch her, a look of profound respect in his dark eyes. It was in the way she would instinctively reach out to steady him when he grew tired. They spoke of their pasts, not with sorrow, but with the quiet understanding of fellow survivors. They were two lonely souls who had found an anchor in the most unlikely of storms. One evening, as they sat by the fire cleaning their weapons, he reached out and gently touched the scar on her knuckles, a souvenir from her fight with the coyotes. "The hands of a warrior," he said softly. She did not pull away. In his touch, there was no possession, only a shared strength. "We do what we must to survive," she replied. "No," he corrected gently. "We do what we must to live." A few days later, just as Cale had predicted, Silas's men came. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men with the SB brand of the Blackwood Ranch on their saddles. They didn't ride up to the cabin. Instead, they took a position on a nearby ridge. Their message was clear. "We are watching. We own this valley. You are an insect under our boot." That night, under the cover of darkness, they made their move. They didn't storm the cabin. Their goal was to break her spirit piece by piece. Abigail awoke to the frantic bawling of Jezebel, her cow. Rushing outside, she saw 2 of the men cutting the fence to her corral, trying to drive off her precious few animals. A shot rang out, not from her Winchester, but from the dark shape of the rocks behind the cabin. One of the men yelled and clutched his arm, the rifle he was holding clattering to the ground. It was Cale. He had taken up a sniper's position, using the train just as he had taught her. A second shot kicked up the dust at the other man's feet, sending him scrambling for cover. Abigail raised her own rifle and fired not at the men, but at the ground near their horses, spooking the animals into a panicked flight. The raiders, one wounded and both now on foot, cursed and vanished into the night. They had won the first skirmish, but the victory was sobering. This was just the beginning. The next day, a new rider approached, Sheriff Brody from Redemption. He was a portly man with a weary face and a tarnished star pinned to his vest. He dismounted heavily, his eyes taking in the fortified look of the small homestead. "Ma'am," he sighed, removing his hat, "I'm here on a friendly warning. Silas Blackwood runs this territory. He's got money, influence, and a temper like a rattlesnake. He's convinced the town council that you're harboring a hostile renegade." "The man in my cabin is a guest, recovering from injuries," Abigail stated coldly. The only hostility I've seen has come from Mr. Blackwood's men. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. People are scared, ma'am. There's been trouble with Koshi's bands to the south. Any Apache is seen as a threat right now. Blackwood is stoking that fire. He's telling folks you've gone native. And what do you say, Sheriff? Abigail challenged, her gaze unwavering. Brody looked at the ground at his worn-out boots. I say a man deserves to be judged by his own actions. But I'm one voice against many. And Blackwood, I owe him. He helped me out of a bad spot a few years back. He doesn't let a man forget a debt. He looked up, his eyes pleading. He's not a man to cross. Take his money and go. It's the only safe play. This is my home, Abigail said, her voice quiet but unyielding as granite. I'm not running anymore. The sheriff sighed again, a man trapped between his conscience and his obligations. Then God help you, ma'am, he said, mounting his horse, because the law can't. As Brody rode away, Cale emerged from the cabin. He had heard everything. His face was grim. He is trying to turn the whole valley against you, Cale said. He will use their fear as a weapon. It's not just the land, is it? Abigail asked, looking at him. He mentioned the spring, but he's obsessed with this specific plot of land. Why? Cale was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, fixed on the mesa that burned orange in the late afternoon sun. He does not know what he is truly trying to steal, he said finally. The spring he spoke of. It is merely the entrance. The water flows from a place deep within the rock. He turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had ever seen it. My people call it Golini, the breath of the mountain. It is not just water. It is a series of caves, a sacred place. It is where the spirits of our ancestors dwell. There are paintings on the walls that tell the story of our creation. It is the heart of my people in this land. The revelation struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a fight over property rights or water. It was a fight for the soul of a people. Silas Blackwood, in his blind, ravenous greed, was trying to possess a church, a holy sanctum, a place of immense spiritual power he couldn't even begin to comprehend. And her small, stubborn homestead was the only thing standing in his way. He thinks he is fighting a lone woman and a wounded man, Kyle said, his voice low and resonant with a power she had not heard before. He does not understand. We are not just defending a cabin. We are defending the breath of the mountain, and the spirits of my ancestors are watching. A profound sense of purpose settled over Abigail. Her personal fight for freedom had become intertwined with something far larger, far more significant. She was no longer just a woman who had run from her past. She was a guardian, a gatekeeper. That night there was no more space between them. The looming threat and the sacredness of their cause had burned away all hesitation. As the desert stars glittered in the ink-black sky, Cal told her stories of the stargazers, his people's name for the constellations. She, in turn, read him a passage from a book of poetry, her voice soft in the firelight. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw, his touch gentle but firm. Abigail, he said, her name no longer a mystery, but a term of endearment. Your spirit is as strong as this land. She leaned into his touch, finding not a collar of possession, but a promise of partnership. They were from different worlds, their lives a tapestry of pain and survival. But here, on the precipice of a battle they were likely to lose, they had found a shared home. They would face Silas Blackwood and his hired guns, not as a man and a woman, but as two warriors bound by a sacred trust, ready to make their final stand. The siege was about to begin. The final days of Blackwood's ultimatum evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet. The air grew thick with anticipation, a humming tension you could feel on your skin. Abigail and Kyle worked relentlessly, their movements economical, their words few. They were a single unit, their thoughts moving in tandem. They stockpiled water, barricaded the cabin's single window with heavy planks, and created firing positions among the rocks, using the land itself as their primary fortification. Kyle, now moving with a grim fluidity, his wound a dull ache rather than a crippling injury, set a series of traps, deadfalls and snares along the main approaches to the homestead. His skills were turning the landscape into a weapon. The dawn of the final day broke with an ominous beauty, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The silence of the desert was absolute, a held breath before a scream. They were positioned in the rocks above the cabin, Kyle with his captured rifle, Abigail with her Winchester. They had a clear view of the valley below. Around mid-morning they appeared, a dust cloud on the horizon that slowly resolved into a dozen riders. At their head, on his expensive bay horse, was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't sending his men this time. He was leading them. He had come to personally oversee the eradication of this defiant blot on his empire. He brings a war party for 2 people, Cale observed, his voice eerily calm. He is not a strong man. He is a fearful one. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat, but her hands were steady on the stock of her rifle. This was it, the culmination of her escape, her survival. She was no longer running. She was the final line of defense. Blackwood's men fanned out, dismounting and preparing to advance on foot. They moved with a swaggering confidence, believing they were about to crush a lone woman and her savage lover. They walked directly into Cale's carefully laid plans. A choked cry of pain from the left flank signaled the first success. A man caught in a rope snare was now dangling upside down from a palo verde tree, swearing violently. Another stumbled into a shallow pit lined with sharpened yucca spines, his howl of agony echoing in the sudden silence. The confident advance faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. "Now," Cal whispered. They opened fire. Not a wild volley, but 2 carefully placed shots. A man aiming at the cabin spun around and fell. Another, trying to take cover, dropped his rifle with a cry as a bullet tore through his shoulder. The element of surprise was total. Blackwood's men, expecting a simple eviction, found themselves in a lethal crossfire, unsure of where the shots were coming from or how many people were firing. Silas roared in frustration, his face purple with rage. "They're in the rocks! Spread out! Burn them out!" The fight descended into a chaotic, desperate struggle. Bullets ricocheted off the boulders around Abigail and Cale, chipping away at their cover. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and sharp. They moved constantly, firing from one position before ghosting to another, creating the illusion of a much larger force. Kyle moved with a silent, deadly grace, a phantom of the rocks. Abigail, her fear burned away and replaced by a cold, clear focus, operated her Winchester with lethal efficiency. She was no longer an Eastern lady debating philosophy. She was the angel of the anvil, defending her sacred ground. But they were still only 2. Blackwood's men, recovering from the initial shock, began a coordinated advance, using the terrain for cover, their numbers a relentless, grinding tide. A bullet grazed Abigail's arm, a searing line of fire. Kyle took a blow to the ribs from a ricochet that made him grunt in pain. They were being pinned down. The end seemed inevitable. Then from the direction of redemption, another sound. The thunder of a lone horse, galloping hard. Silas Blackwood turned, an oath on his lips, likely expecting reinforcements. Instead, he saw Sheriff Brody, his face set in a grim mask of determination, a shotgun held across his saddle. Brody had made his choice. His debt to Blackwood had been paid, but his debt to his own conscience was now due. "Blackwood!" Brody yelled, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "This is official town business. Lay down your arms. You are under arrest for attempted murder." The distraction was all Abigail and Cale needed. As Blackwood's men hesitated, looking from the sheriff to their enraged employer, Cale and Abigail unleashed another volley. 2 more men went down. The remaining men, seeing the law arrive and realizing their simple intimidation job had turned into a full-blown war, lost their nerve. They began to fall back, helping their wounded, wanting no part of a fight against the law. Silas was left standing almost alone, his war party deserting him. His face was a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. He looked at the retreating forms of his men, at the resolute figure of Sheriff Brody, and then his eyes filled with a crazed hatred, locked onto Abigail as she moved to a new position. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "This is all because of you. If I can't have this land, no one will." He raised his own pistol, not aiming for Abigail, but for the crude wooden structure of the cabin below. A single shot, a spark, and the dry timber baked by years of sun would go up like a torch. He would destroy her home, and with it, the entrance to the sacred caves. But before he could pull the trigger, a shape launched itself from the rocks above. It was Kale. He had no more bullets. He held only the broken bow he had been found with, using it now as a club. He slammed into Silas, knocking him from his horse. The two men crashed to the ground in a desperate, violent tangle. Silas was bigger, stronger, but Kale fought with the ferocity of a man defending not just his life, but the heart of his people. Abigail scrambled down the rocks, her rifle ready, but she couldn't get a clear shot. It ended as it began, with bare hands and brutal force. Silas, his face contorted with rage, pinned Kale to the ground, his hands going for Kale's throat. But Abigail was there. She didn't fire. She swung the heavy stock of her Winchester like a club, just as she had against the Coyotes, connecting solidly with Silas's temple. He grunted, his eyes rolling back in his head, and collapsed unconscious. Silence descended once more upon the valley, broken only by the panting breaths of the survivors and the groans of the wounded. Sheriff Brody rode up, his shotgun still at the ready. He looked down at the unconscious form of Silas Blackwood, then at Abigail and Kale standing side by side, battered, bleeding, but unbroken. "Looks like the law finally found its way to the right side of the valley," Brody said, a weary respect in his voice. The aftermath was a blur. Brody and a few hastily deputized townsfolk rounded up the remainder of Blackwood's forces. Silas was hauled away in chains, his empire of greed and fear crumbling into the Arizona dust. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in forgiving shades of pink and gold, Abigail and Kale stood alone in front of their cabin. The cabin was scarred, but it was still standing. The land was theirs. The breath of the mountain was safe. Kyle turned to her, his face bruised but his eyes clear. He gently took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The touch was no longer just one of partnership. It was one of profound, unspoken love, forged in fire and blood. "It's over," Abigail whispered. "No," Kale said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land that stretched before them. "It is just beginning." They had faced the ghosts of their past and had not flinched. They had stood against overwhelming force and had not broken. On a devil's anvil, under a relentless sun, a disgraced lady from Philadelphia and a displaced Apache warrior had found more than just survival. They had found freedom. They had found a home. And in the heart of the wild, untamed West, they had found each other. Abigail and Kale's story is a testament to the fact that home isn't always a place you are born to, but a place you are willing to fight for. It's a reminder that courage can be found in the most desperate of circumstances, and that the most unlikely bonds can forge the strongest shields against the darkness. They faced down their past, stood together against greed and hatred, and in the end, protected not just a piece of land, but the sacred soul of a people. Their fight was over, but their life, a new chapter written in the dust and rock of the Arizona territory, was just beginning. If this story of survival, courage, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit resonated with you, please honor their tale by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and be sure to subscribe for more unforgettable stories from the untamed heart of the West.